Hello, everyone, and welcome to Afternoons with the Author on this cold and soon to be snowy, to be determined about that Tuesday. My name is Stacy, and I'm a reader services librarian at the Syosset Public Library. I'm joined by Donna Berger, who is our fellow co-host and also a reader services librarian. And we are very, very excited to have the author Robert Kolker joining us today. Robert Kolker is the author of the book we'll be focusing on today, Hidden Valley Road, a memoir about the Galvins and their struggle with mental illness, an instant New York Times bestseller, and a selection of Oprah's Book Club. He also wrote Lost Girls, a novel recounting the lives of 5 sex workers murdered by the Long Island serial killer. He's also known for reporting as he is a National Magazine Award finalist, and his work has appeared in New York Magazine, the New York Times Magazine, Bloomberg Businessweek, Wired, the Oprah Magazine, and the Marshall Project. Both Publishers Weekly and Kirkus gave Hidden Valley Road starred reviews. Publishers Weekly said that journalist Kolker delivers a powerful look at schizophrenia and the quest to understand it, while Kirkus states Kolker deftly follows the psychiatric, chemical, and biological theories proposed to explain schizophrenia and the various treatments foisted upon the brothers. Most poignantly, he portrays the impact of the unafflicted children of the brothers' illness, an oppressive emotional atmosphere, and the family's festering secrets. If you visit the library regularly, you might have noticed that both of his books have been staff picks. Hidden Valley Road has been Donna's staff pick, and you will see it throughout our social media as well when we post some of our staff picks. We love you at our library, Robert. So now on to some technical aspects of today's program. Today's program will be held through Zoom webinar mode, so you will only see right now the spotlight's on Robert, but you'll hear Donna and I as we answer questions. We'll begin with a short presentation by the author and then move on to a question and answer section. In webinar mode, we will not be able to hear or see our audience members. And if you want to ask a question or even shout a comment, use the Q&A. We have disabled the chat. Depending on your device, this option can be typically found at the bottom of your screen, whether you use a phone, computer, Surface, tablet, what have you. Just tap or click on the Q&A option and type in your question or comment, and Donna and I will read it aloud. Once again, the chat option has been disabled for today's event. On behalf of the Reader Services Department, we are so glad to have you join us today, and please help us welcome author Robert Kolker. The floor is yours, Robert.
Thank you, Stacy, and thank you, Donna. I'm very, very happy to speak with everybody here, and I'm really grateful to the Syosset Library for the chance to talk about Hidden Valley Road. I've been really grateful and overwhelmed about the reception that the book received last year, particularly as everyone had so much else to focus on besides a new nonfiction book. But I think the family story is eye-opening for sure, and then of course what it might have to tell us about the nature of acute mental illness is a story that I think a lot of people related to. And then beyond that, it's also a family saga. It's a very emotional story independent of mental illness. I just couldn't be happier with the way it's been received, how people have found the humanity in what could have been a more voyeuristic story. And that sort of is something that I try to do in everything I write, to try to make sure that it's not about rubbernecking or voyeurism, that it's about trying to find a human connection to people who we might not necessarily think we feel a connection to. So I guess that's a long way of saying that I'm not a doctor and I'm not a patient. And I don't have acute mental illness in my life or in my family. I'm a writer, I'm a journalist. And I've been writing in one way or another even before high school, but I discovered reporting and journalism in my 20s when I was a reporter for a little community newspaper on the west side of Manhattan. People my age who got into journalism, they tended to do it because of Woodward and Bernstein, they wanted to be foreign correspondents or cover the White House, but I never really connected with journalism in that way. Instead, I kind of connected with reporting on everyday people. And at this little newspaper on the west side of Manhattan, we returned to the same people dealing with the same situations. Some of them were fighting a new skyscraper that was going up or dealing with a crime problem on their street. And week after week, it was a little bit like a soap opera that people could follow. And I developed relationships with the sources. I understood them and could walk in their shoes for a little while. And I found I was comfortable doing that. And I became fascinated by nonfiction writing that had a narrative flair to it. some people call it new journalism or long form journalism or narrative nonfiction, whatever you want to call it. That's what I decided I wanted to do. And my career really took shape several years later at New York Magazine, where I landed just before I turned 30. And I spent 15 years there writing feature stories and cover stories. And I was always sort of drawn to stories that required a lot of research and reporting on complicated issues, like schizophrenia, for instance. But at the end of the day, they focused on the interior lives of ordinary people. And so through exhaustive reporting, what I wanted to do was try to lift a veil on a part of the world that we would otherwise never see, and recognize the humanity in people we might never have considered before are really quite like us. And in my first book, Lost Girls, I sort of continued in that vein. That's a nonfiction book about an unsolved series of killings not far from you guys in Long Island. It's a murder mystery, but a very unusual one because there is no solution. And in that way, it's really more of a social issues book. And it's a book about people, about 5 victims and 5 families around those victims. And it kind of examines, by telling their stories, the question of what made them vulnerable. And it gets deep into those family relationships, their strife and their estrangements and their bonds. And now with Hidden Valley Road, I happened upon a way to explore the subject of family relationships more deeply than I ever dreamed I'd be able to. The story of Hidden Valley Road for me really begins about 5 years ago, just before the spring of 2016, when a friend of mine introduced me to the 2 sisters in the family, Margaret Galvin Johnson and Lindsay Galvin Rauch. Margaret and Lindsay were both in their 50s, and they were the youngest siblings and the only girls in a family that had 12 children. So they had 10 older brothers, and of those 10 older brothers, 6 of them had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. And the more I learned about the Galvin family, the more I couldn't believe their story. It was really horrifying. The oldest brother, Donald, tried to kill his wife before being sent to a state mental hospital. He ended up being sent to the state mental hospital more than 20 times. And another son, Joseph, sent threatening letters to the president. Another son, Matthew, thought that he was Paul McCartney. Another one once shattered the windows of the house in front of his parents. And then there was Brian, who killed his girlfriend and then himself in 1973. And that was really the low point for the family, where the family almost completely collapsed and was scattered to the winds. There was also sexual abuse and clergy abuse, all this in one family. I couldn't imagine it. And I wondered how such a family could even pretend to stay together under such horrible circumstances. I wondered why these 2 sisters, for instance, wouldn't have just run away the first chance they got, never to come back. They could change their names or just decide that they'd had enough. But the sisters, when I spoke with them, showed that they still had a reservoir of hope. They told me how each of them found a way through their traumatic childhoods. And they told me that their family has a scientific legacy, that they were so statistically unusual that they became one of the first families to be studied by the National Institute of Mental Health as part of the search for the genetic origins of schizophrenia. And later on, when I talked with several of the researchers who have analyzed the family's genetic material, I learned that samples of the Galvin family's DNA helped form the cornerstone of genetic research into schizophrenia that continues today. And even the family hadn't really known at the time that they first spoke to me just how important they were to these researchers' work. The sisters came to me because they wanted their family's story told in an innovative way. They didn't want to write a memoir. They wanted an impartial journalist like me to incorporate everybody's perspective, even the sick brothers, as a work of independent journalism. And on the one hand, that was pretty daring. I can't think of another book out there that does this sort of thing, not as a memoir, but as an impartial work of journalism that gets everybody's point of view in one large family. And I was pretty skeptical because I'm a reporter and I know about the medical privacy laws, and you probably do too in our country, the HIPAA laws. You have to give consent for your medical information to be public. And so that would mean that everybody in this family would have to consent to be reported on. And I figured it's a large family. It would be a matter of time before somebody would disagree and not want this book written. But what I hadn't realized is that they were ready, that their mother, Mimi, the oldest living family member, was 90, and it was now or never. And also some of the worst things that happened to the family happened so long ago that people were ready to talk. And the fact that the sisters were so interested in doing it, that really made a big difference too. A lot of people deferred to her, to the 2 sisters in the family. But there was a lot to get past here. I mean, mental illness is a sensitive subject. Often it's too painful to discuss with other people. Even when I was working on the book and told people what I was working on, I learned about mental illness in those people's lives, among family members, things they never discussed before because of the stigma. So it was a big bet. It was a daring thing to do to try to, for them to come to me and for me to try to pull all of these different threads together into something that actually made sense and that was accurate and fair and emotional, and that you could tell all the characters apart. It was a tricky one to do, but nobody had ever tried it before, so that was really attractive to me. I structured the book as a family saga, as if you were reading a novel about a family like the family in East of Eden, for instance. I start with the parents, Don and Mimi Galvin, marrying during World War II, moving to Colorado and raising their family. Their dozen children are born during the baby boom. Donald, the oldest one, is born in 1945, and Lindsay, the youngest, in 1965. You know, this is the American century. It's filled with optimism. You start to see warning signs that something is amiss, but the parents have no preparation for what happens next. And the kids start to have their psychotic breaks after the 12th child is born in the late 60s. And then years later, the decisions that the Galvin parents made when everything was going badly become reevaluated later by the children as they grow up. So part 2 of the book has the children growing up. Apart from being able to tell that story sensitively and accurately, one of the biggest challenges of this book was to portray mental illness accurately, perhaps in a way that hadn't been tried in nonfiction before. I think that our popular culture has a way of othering the mentally ill in both low and high ways. You know, sometimes the mentally ill people in books are like monsters, and sometimes they're vulnerable, precious, helpless souls who have special insight that the rest of us lack access to. But I think that the real normal, most common situation is somewhere in between that the people who are severely mentally ill are people. They don't have special insight, and they aren't monsters either. And I thought, what if I wrote about a family with 6 mentally ill children and wrote about the mentally ill children in the same way that I wrote about the non-ill children, just like they were people? And I visited with the surviving mentally ill sons, and I found that they were very easy to write about. They were very approachable, and it was clear they were suffering from their mental illnesses, but it also was clear that they weren't, you know, robots or automatons. They were people. Donald has an air of peace about him when he talks about his family, and Matt is kind of grouchy much of the time, but also grateful for the help he gets. And Peter is a natural performer, playing the recorder for everyone. So spending time with them helped me understand that mental illness is really not a cookie cutter condition, and that even in people in the same family can manifest it differently. So the story itself in Hidden Valley Road it's also about the history of the evolving science of mental illness throughout the 20th century. And that's not always a pretty story. It's about barbaric treatments like lobotomies, and researchers working in silos and not talking to one another, about different theories that are just dead wrong, but yet rule the roost for many years. I cover a lot of ground in the book, trying to weave in a lot of medical information. And the challenge for me was to make sure that it didn't feel like you were being made to eat your vegetables. The idea was that everything I introduce in the way of medical information was something that would kind of raise the emotional stakes for the story of the Galvin family. And what I'm trying to say really is that the scientific story in Hidden Valley Road is meant to work in service of the family story. And what I learned about the family was that even the well children were severely affected by what was happening in their family. They sometimes felt like they were carrying an unstable element inside themselves. They wondered how much longer before the illness would get them too. And so what I wanted to do in the book was to find a couple of the family members to really be mainstays for the reader. And I decided that Lindsay and Margaret, the 2 sisters, would be people who we knew we would come back to over and over again, and we would learn more about their relationship, a complicated relationship, as we go on. I'm ready to be in conversation now with Donna and to take questions from you all, but I'll just end by saying that the stakes here are, of course, about more than just one family. That schizophrenia, for those who in the audience who don't know, it affects an estimated 1 in 100 people, or more than 3 million people in America. and 82 million people worldwide. So by those odds, if you walk into a supermarket or a Costco or a car dealership or anywhere with 100 people milling around, chances are at least one of them might be suffering from a severe mental illness like schizophrenia. Thank you, and look forward to taking your questions.
Okay, does anyone have some questions? Questions are coming in. Let's see. Lisa wants to know, was there anything in your research that you found personally horrifying, treatments, etc.?
Well, I think the thing I expected to find was the thing we all know about, like lobotomies and electroshock therapy, things that we might have seen in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest or just know in the popular culture. So I was kind of braced for that. But my big surprise was that, in our lifetimes, mental illness has been thought of as a sort of a brain chemistry issue. And there have been a lot of great new drugs that, along with therapy, seem to be helping for a lot of conditions like depression or anxiety or bipolar disorder. And I kind of assumed that schizophrenia was one of those conditions. But what I learned and what really shocked me is that they're using basically the same drugs that they used 40 or 50 years ago. And that those drugs are not cures. They're essentially symptom suppressors. They're a way to make the patients more manageable. But they have severe health effects of their own, and they don't roll back the clock for patients, at least not for most of them. And so it kind of shocked me that society kind of would allow no innovation over many, many decades for these people who are clearly suffering.
I was wondering, in the family, the family members that were not ill, they've gone on to have families. Has schizophrenia shown up in their children?
Not yet, and they're very grateful for that. They were told that quite likely the odds were basically the same as it would be for any family having children, that what was happening in this generation of Galvins was most likely a once in a blue moon combination of genetic material from both Galvin parents. And so once it wasn't like they all inherited a dominant gene that then from then on would be destiny going forward. So that's the tricky thing about schizophrenia. There is no one gene. We've sequenced the human genome and we found more than 100 genes that have mutations that might be players in the way that schizophrenia develops. But each of those genes, each of those more than 100 genes, has such a small little improved chance of developing schizophrenia that it's hard to pinpoint the problem on any one genetic problem. So when you have a family like this that has such a powerful result, you can't help but want to study it to see what it says about where schizophrenia takes shape in the brain. But what's happening with them genetically probably won't be repeated family to family. And that's the curious thing. There are some breakthroughs, though, that the science has had because of studying families like the Galvins, including families like the Galvins.
That's interesting. Okay, we have a patron who said, Diane said, I just read Divided Minds by the Spiro sisters, who were twins. It was harrowing. Are you aware of this book?
I'm not. Let me Google it. Divided Mind. So they are twins with schizophrenia. So there is a seminal case, a very influential case of quadruplets with schizophrenia that were studied by the National Institute of Mental Health in the 50s and 60s. And they make it in the literature a lot, and I kind of spotlight them in the book. But the story of these twins escaped me, and I'm definitely going to read about it. It's interesting because on the one hand, you get to see how genes play out. On the other hand, the people who really believe that nurture has as much to do with it as nature would argue that these twins have the same parents, right? Or that the quadruplets I talked about had the same parents. So it's not a completely settled issue. So it'll be interesting to see what the Spiros themselves have to say about it for themselves as they've grown up.
Yes, our commenter said one twin is very ill and the other is not.
Yeah, there you go. So this is what I've learned. What I've learned is that genetics aren't destiny completely. they're a
Right.
blueprint. So it's not like you have a gene that says 2 weeks after your 22nd birthday, you're going to have your first psychotic break. And then it happens at 6 a.m. that day. What you have is a genetic predisposition, or perhaps you might even call it a vulnerability. And that quite often it's something in your environment that triggers things that sets it off at some point. And that thing quite often can't be predicted. Some people argue that it could be marijuana, or other people say it could be child abuse or head trauma from a football injury, or any number of other things. Some people argue it could be a positive trauma, like leaving home and going to college for the first time. Suddenly you're overstimulated in a way that sets off your vulnerability. So so there is a little bit of nurture involved. So if we assume that these twins have completely identical genetics, it could make sense that one of them would become sicker. The question is why?
Right.
Definitely interesting. We have a question from Evelyn. Were you surprised that you had cooperation from the whole family?
I was, and I took it very slowly. I had just started a new job. It was 5 years ago. I'd been freelancing for a while, and I wrote a lot for Bloomberg Business Week, and they hired me. They said, "Do you want to be full time here?" And so I'm sitting there at Bloomberg's, swanky offices, and it's been just a couple weeks, and I get on the phone with the two sisters, and I said to them, "Nothing really happens very quickly with books anyway. So if you're willing to be patient, why don't we take it very slowly? And why don't I get on the phone once a week with a different family member of yours, starting with your mother, and I'll spend an hour on the phone with everybody, and I'll also have a phone call with a couple of the medical researchers who know about the family." So it'll take maybe 10 weeks, once a week, and have very casual conversations with people. Instead of saying, "I'm writing a book," what I would say is, "I just spoke with your sisters and they're interested in a book about the family, and how does that make you feel?" And then I would just feel them all out. And then I told the sisters that by the end of that 10 weeks, we would all know one way or another whether this will be possible or not. It'll be very obvious if there's a problem. And there wasn't a problem. Everybody was ready. And a few weeks after that, I flew out to Colorado and met everybody for the first time and interviewed Mimi, the matriarch of the family, for many, many hours, and wrote up a book proposal. But I really didn't get started on the actual book until about a year after that first phone call. So very, very slowly, I built up a head of steam, which is really a great way to go, frankly, because working on a book is no small thing. So it's good to be sure about it. So by the time I got the publishing deal to write the book, I was, completely confident that I could come up with something.
Okay. There's another question that said, how were you notified that your book was selected as an Oprah Book Club Pick? And what was that experience like?
I would say it was a dream come true, but I hadn't even dared to dream that it would come true. Most of Oprah's books are fiction. So as a nonfiction writer, I never really thought that this book would be in the running for something like that. But it came at the perfect time. It was the middle of March when I heard, and the state and the city and the country were shutting down. And this was a point where, if you can remember, turn your head back to last March, it was a moment where we weren't just worried if restaurants were going to close. We were worried if everyone's going to run out of toilet paper. And for an author, what I was wondering was, will Amazon still be shipping books when my book comes out? Because maybe they'll just turn all of the resources to working on essential products, not books. So the whole book might go away. So when the phone rang, and it was Oprah Winfrey herself, because I think she likes to have that kind of Ed McMahon, Publishers Clearinghouse moment where, to announce that you're the winner. So it was herself. My first reaction was to start laughing, because I thought, here I am worried that the book isn't going to find readers. And now it's a sure thing that it's going to find readers. It's wonderful. It was miraculous. And she was very nice on the phone. What I learned later is that I didn't need to be so surprised, that mental health and mental illness is something that she's always been interested in different ways. And the legacy of abuse and trauma is something that she's very interested in. And in fact, she was working with Prince Harry, I think, on a possible documentary about mental health. And so someone at Oprah magazine passed her an early copy of Hidden Valley Road saying, maybe this will be helpful to you. And that's one of many ways that Oprah gets books put in front of her is by the folks at Oprah Magazine. And so she read it and she said, why don't we make this a book club book? And everyone said, okay.
We have a question from a patron, Fran, who says, what are the breakthroughs in this condition?
Well, there's been no major breakthrough pharmaceutically, no great miracle drug. And there's been no major breakthrough in terms of the genetics, as I tried to ham-handedly explain before. They've sequenced the human genome, but they haven't found one big smoking gun gene that we can go after, that we can blame schizophrenia on. But we know now that early intervention is important. That if you can help a troubled teenager who is starting to become slightly distant or disconnected and find therapies for them and drugs as well that might be helpful to them, that can keep them from having psychotic breaks. And the more psychotic breaks you have, the more difficult it is to sort of right the ship and have a more functional life. So there's a lot of hope based on early intervention. But for early intervention to work, there has to be an end to the stigma, right? I mean, you have to have parents ready to bring their child to a doctor, which is something the Galvins were not ready to do way back when, because the Galvin kids grew up at a time where parents were blamed, where therapists would say, your mother must have mistreated you. That's why you have a mental illness. And we know now that that's not necessarily the case. And so we're more evolved in our understanding, and there's more community support for those lucky enough to have health benefits. Those are the breakthroughs. And the big hope is that that trend will continue, and that people who seek mental health services in jails, in prisons, or homeless people who need social services, that those people will be less stigmatized too, that there will be help for those people, and that they will not be considered a public safety problem, but a public health problem.
Do you think that there's a lack of support from big pharma for the drugs because people afflicted are kind of forgotten and pushed away? You know, they don't want to be, not to be seen, or like, is there a lack of interest there?
Yeah, I think there are a bunch of reasons. The first is that most of the pharmaceutical companies have a version of the existing drugs out there, and they're selling fine, and that they're helping manage patients' symptoms, and those symptoms are those patients are more manageable. Some of them can live in group settings, and so there isn't. It's not like there's from their point of view, there's a 5-alarm fire to be solved by coming up with a new drug. But there are other reasons too. It's expensive and risky to develop drugs like this because you can't test them on animals first. You know, mice or rats don't get schizophrenia. So you have to test it on humans, and you have to do those in tiny little trials all over the world. And that's very expensive. So you need a really compelling reason financially to be able to lay out that kind of money. And then there are other reasons too. There's a political reason, which is that this constituency, even though the National Alliance on Mental Illness exists and does great work, there is no huge groundswell of public support for innovating in this area. It's not like breast cancer or prostate cancer or lung cancer. There still is a stigma.
One of our patrons says, that's how I learned of your book, Oprah Magazine. It's a fascinating read.
Oh, thank you. She really saved the book. If I wasn't clear already, she rescued it. I mean, it was a tough year last year for any author writing something that wasn't about, you know, the problems with our policing, or about the pandemic, or about politics. And this book wasn't about any of those things. And so for her to spotlight it in this way, it was a total rescue, and I'm just overjoyed.
Lisa said that, so you wrote about the Long Island serial killer and the article that became the movie Bad Education. Do you have anything else Long Island related on the horizon?
You know, I used to write about Long Island a lot because I started full-time at New York Magazine in the late 90s. And I lived in Brooklyn. That was when people were in Manhattan, young people were starting to move out to Brooklyn, and I was one of the earlier group, and I had a car. So that meant that if there was an interesting story idea out on Long Island, it was much easier for me to hop in the car and go out and check it out than it would be for anybody else to go out and report it. And it was a few years after Amy Fisher and Joey Buttafuoco or whatever, but there were still lots of really, really compelling criminal justice stories to be told out there. I wrote about the murder of Ted Ammon out in the Hamptons. That was, very high profile case where his wife, his ex-wife, had got her new husband, and who used to be their electrician, to murder him. And I wrote about the Mepham High School hazing scandal, a really terrible story out of Mepham High School where boys were really brutally hurt by their teammates. And I wrote about the Roslyn, Long Island embezzlement, public school embezzlement, and that was back in 2004. And it was quite a nice surprise when Mike Makowski, who grew up in Roslyn and became a screenwriter, decided to write about his hometown and option that story. So I really can't take credit for that becoming a movie, but I'm very, very happy with how it turned out. And really, I like Mike a lot. I've met him since then, and he's really very nice. And then of course with the serial killer case, I was out there a lot. And there are at least 3 or 4 other feature stories for New York that I did about Long Island. And it's been interesting to me just how large it is, that you really can't generalize about it. For instance, I've probably written more about Long Island than anyone else from New York Magazine, but I've never been to Syosset. I've never been to, and that's amazing to me. I mean, that's to me, it's just further evidence of how large Long Island is.
Well, you're always welcome here. We have a question from Evelyn. Where are the other 4 males from the family that don't have schizophrenia? Are they leading normal lives?
They are, and that's the interesting thing about the 6 who are not ill, that if you ran into them at a supermarket or, I don't know, a ski slope or something, they would seem nothing remarkable about them. They have families, they're functional. I think if there's one thing they all share, it's a certain hypervigilance that I think anybody who grows up with childhood trauma has. Like, you're always sort of walking on eggshells and wondering, what the downside might be in a particular situation. But other than that, they're very different people, the same way that all adult siblings are. John is the oldest living non-diagnosed mentally ill brother. So he's in his 70s, and he's a retired music teacher living in Idaho with his wife. And he's got kids and grandchildren as well. But it was many years before he told them told his kids that they had, 6 uncles with mental illness. Imagine being so scarred by the experience that you wouldn't share that with your kids. So he eventually did, but it took him a long time to really be truthful about that with his kids. He was just so frightened by what had happened in his childhood. And Mark Galvin is a very sweet guy. He's retired also. He worked as a manager at the university bookstore at University of Colorado for many, many years. But he's, was married and has kids, and in his retirement, I think he drives an Uber now, but he's a dad and a granddad, but he's a little marooned. He's a little isolated because the people he was closest to in the family were 3 brothers who were closest to him in age, and they were inseparable as kids. And those 3 all developed severe mental illness, all developed schizophrenia. So it's like he lost the closest people in his family, and it makes him very sad to talk about it all. Richard Galvin, he lives in Denver. He's a businessman. He had a very close relationship with the mother of the family, Mimi, and was very much in simpatico with her. And so he really feels her loss terribly, but he's a very upbeat guy, very positive guy. Did I get to 4? Let's see. Oh, Michael's he plays classical guitar. He's the hippie of the family. And he's still a hippie. He's got a ponytail still, and he plays music, and he lives in Manitou Springs, which is a little like Berkeley, California, only in Colorado. And it's right next to where they all grew up in Colorado Springs. And he's married and is a grandfather now. very sweet guy.
When I read this book, it was right during the pandemic and the lockdown, and I just couldn't stop reading it. I felt it was like fiction, but it was even better because it was real, and it was so the story of the Galvins was so intertwined with the story of the science that it just was so easy to understand. And I was just like, oh my gosh, these people, what a life, and what a gift for sharing it with you and us. But oh, I can't believe that so many children, just having one like that could destroy a family. But when you were said about writing it, how did you, the process of getting all the stories together and keeping things flowing, and do you have folders and charts, or what is your process like?
I was very frightened at first about how I was going to corral it all together. And would I be able to come up with a way to make sure that when I circled back and said, meanwhile, Michael was doing whatever, that the reader wouldn't pick up the book and throw it across the room and say, oh my God, I don't know, who's Michael? Again, is he Richard, or I was afraid that would happen. So I kept two separate timelines, very elaborate timelines, not just names and dates, but long quotes and pieces of interviews and news clippings, whatever I could find. The first timeline was a family timeline. So starting with the Galvin family ancestors and moving up to the present day, everything I could find so that I could situate stuff in time. And then the other timeline is the schizophrenia timeline, the science timeline, about how our thinking about schizophrenia, how it changed over the years. And so that calmed me down a little bit. And then I started to sort of find groupings of ways to make things a chapter and things to highlight. And then to really answer your question, I saw that in really big books with lots of big characters, that the authors were very confident about being able to take a chapter and just focus on one person, that they didn't have to cut away in the middle of the chapter and say, this was happening at the same time that Sally was doing this and that so-and-so was doing that. They didn't bother doing that. And they knew that the reader would read it, and they'd have faith that once the chapter was over, you would then go back and catch up with other people elsewhere. And it actually makes things a lot easier for everyone. And you see the same thing happen on TV shows with lots of characters about big families, like, I don't know, This Is Us or whatever, or Parenthood. You can have an episode that really is spending a lot of time on just one character, and it's okay. It's okay. You aren't sitting there going, I wonder what's happening with Cheryl around the corner. You know that you're going to get back to that. So I calmed down a little bit that way too. And then if you've seen the physical book, I came up with an idea of almost keeping the characters as a scorecard or a program at the beginning of every chapter. So I have the list of the family's names at the top of every chapter, and the people I'm going to focus on in that chapter are in boldface. So you sort of are reminded about who's who as you go through.
We also have another. Go ahead, Stacy.
No, I was gonna say that's cool. I have to look at the physical book, which we have in the library, regular print, huge print.
A little like it's like a baseball program, so you can you know who's up at bat at the beginning of every chapter. So you see their names in boldface.
Did you want to ask the question from?
Sure, there's two more questions. One says, has any more acceptance been seen since celebrities have been coming out with their own stories of mental illness in their own families?
Yeah, I think the more that happens, the better. It certainly is. It's so common that I think it can cascade after a while. That sooner or later we'll start to hear that some superstar has a mentally ill sister or brother, and we'll say, oh yes, of course, it happens a lot. The same way that we hear, that somebody has a sibling with a drug problem or anything else that we might consider abnormal, or years ago might have been scandalous. Now it's like, oh yes, it's something that happens. And I'm very hopeful about that's the direction we're going.
And we have a question from Jackie. Any interest in writing fiction?
I've never really been had that impulse. I know that there are a bunch of people in my line of work, like magazine writers and journalists, who had like a novel or a screenplay sitting in the drawer that they were thinking, noodling with, but that was never my thing. Sometimes I think it was about the turf I carved out as a kid, because my brother, who I love dearly, he was more interested in creative writing and like novels and poetry and such. And so I must have, from a very early age, decided, well, my thing will be different from his thing. I'll write, but it'll be something else. And so I kind of paved a different road that way.
Did you study journalism? Did you say that? You, like, when you went to college, that was like, I'm going to be a journalism major?
I was undergraduate at Columbia, where they don't have a journalism major for undergrads because it's a strict liberal arts. But I worked on the school paper, and there was like a reverse snobbery at the school paper, thinking we don't have to go to Columbia Journalism School because we're working on the school paper. And of course, half of us ended up in journalism school, but I didn't. For whatever reason, I ended up working at those local papers in Manhattan, and that gave me a lot of really great training, or at least a chance to really work hard to develop and decide what I wanted to do. I since have outgrown my reverse snobbery, and some of the people I love the most in the business who I've worked with have graduate degrees in journalism. They did not waste their time.
Can I ask when you were at Columbia? Because I was at Barnard, so I'm just.
I graduated in 1991.
Oh, okay. You're much younger than me.
We do have a question from another patient. Just curious, for a writer, is nonfiction a bigger market than fiction?
I think it's easier to tell what interest there might be before you get going, because it's just easier to see if there are people out there who might want to read about your thing, whatever it is. Whereas with fiction, if you're just starting out, you're coming in from out of left field. And often you have to either get a couple short stories published and then sell a novel on the strength of the short stories. And then it becomes a first novel. And then that's a huge risk, because if that fails, then no one will ever buy your second novel. It's very, as an outsider to the fiction world, it seems very, very risky to me in terms of finding a market. But with nonfiction, at least you can there's a lower bar to getting published if you're okay with not getting paid. Like, you could go and get a short piece, a reported piece, published somewhere on Medium or elsewhere, and then once that's up and published, you can kind of use that as your calling card and bring that to publishers and say, I want to make this a book, and 100,000 people read it, and I think there's a market for it. So you can make the case for your book a little more clearly.
Evelyn asks, what are you doing now? Are you a full-time author?
I am, and I guess that's a different way of answering the question before. If the question was if there's more of a market for fiction or nonfiction, they both don't pay well early on. And it took me till I was in my 40s, until I was 40, to work on a book. And that's because it's such a big risk. And so I didn't want to write a book until I had an advance that was enough to cover the time that I spent working on it. So the money I got up front from the publisher for Lost Girls was enough for me to take 6 months off of work where I was at New York Magazine. And that way I could go to bed at night and sleep soundly, knowing that if the book sank like a stone, that if it failed, I wouldn't lose any money, because at least, I got paid to take the time off to write the book. And if it did well, then that would be great. And so it did do well, and that got me more meetings for a second book. And then this book, I got paid enough to work on it full time, which is a great luxury, but not anything I could have done when I just started out. So it's like building up inches by inches by inches by inches.
And Jackie asked, have you heard from anyone interested in making Hidden Valley Road into a film or a series?
I have. I think most likely, if anything happens, it'll be a miniseries. That's one thing that, Lost Girls became this really nice movie on Netflix, but it was sold for a movie back in 2013, which is before streaming miniseries became such a big deal. So I think if Lost Girls came out today, it probably would have been a miniseries. And this one, if it happens, it will be too. That way you can get the whole ensemble going, and you can have, an episode devoted to this and an episode devoted to that. And I'd like to be involved this time, which would be fun. I really liked how Lost Girls came out, and I really am in awe of the people who worked on it. And I had no idea how to adapt it. But this time I have a couple ideas, so I'm trying to be involved.
And Evelyn has a question. What are you working on now?
A little bit on a TV adaptation of Hidden Valley Road, a little bit of looking into other big subjects regarding families. I think the next book I would like to write about family estrangements in some way, but I'm not sure how. Feuds and schisms in families that go in and out over generations. And then a little bit of finding topics that I think would make perfect magazine stories and bringing them to various magazines. So I'm kind of doing a little bit of everything.
What have you been reading during the pandemic?
Oh, I have been doing a lot of reading. I'm going to punch, I actually have a list because I always blank out with this question. I said, you know what, I'm going to keep a list. Oh, I read 1,000 Acres finally by Jane Smiley, because there's a story about a family with trauma over many generations and lots of big family secrets that come spilling out, and it was terrific. And then I read about there are a couple great books about the Harvey Weinstein case, and one of them is by Ronan Farrow. It's called Catch and Kill. That's terrific. And then there's a wonderful memoir by Danny Shapiro called Inheritance. That's another story about family secrets spilling out. So you see, I kind of have a trend that I kind of get drawn to.
That's a favorite book here at the library.
Oh, great.
I was like, that should be added to my list. I was like, everyone else is reading it.
And then there's I also read, this is a couple years old, but it's called Rising Out of Hatred by Eli Saslow. He's a wonderful nonfiction writer and author. He's with the Washington Post, and he writes books as well. And this is a book about a guy who, he was almost like royalty among the white supremacists. His father founded the Stormfront organization. His godfather was David Duke. And it's this person's story about how he grows up and comes to question that belief system and develop other ideas. And it's really fascinating because of the access, the intimacy with that he's able to write about him. Yeah, you kind of learn a lot about how people form beliefs and then how those beliefs get questioned over time.
Jackie says Inheritance is fantastic. Try The Lost Family by.
Oh yeah, I've read about that book, but I haven't read it yet. I should definitely read The Lost Family. Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions? We've time for like one more, two more, depending if anyone has one.
How did they decide upon the cover image? It's very striking.
Yeah, that was one of the first things. Very early on, the sisters showed me that picture, and I gasped, and I said, "Oh my God, I would buy this book right now." And I made sure that the picture was on the cover of the book proposal when it went out to publishers, so that people would see it. And then we were looking at book design ideas, and of course, it's such a busy image that there was a question of how do you get a lot of letters and type on a picture like that and still be able to tell what's going on in the picture. And at one point, the idea was to try to fade out the picture so that it would only have like the hint of details in it. And then we looked at that, a couple of mock-ups of that, and we all kind of looked at it and said, there's a reason why we chose this picture. It's because we want to see the picture. We don't want to not see the picture. So we went back and went the other way.
I guess that's all the questions everyone has so far.
Well, I'll take you up on the invitation to Syosset as soon as I can. In the meantime, I couldn't be more grateful that you spotlighted the book this way, and thank you to everybody who showed up today. And to the questioner with the family law question, please email me. I'll be happy to get back to you right away.
So this was a great visit. Thank you so much. Oh, Evelyn says thank you. This is come see us when you can.
Thank you,
He's one of our coworkers.
Evelyn.
And we're very easy to get to. We're off the LIE exit at Northern State. If you guys are interested in purchasing the book of Hidden Valley Road, you could please visit www.bookshop.org. If you'd like to reserve a copy at the library, you could call us at 516-921-7161, extension 239, or you could do it through the catalog. We currently have the regular print and the large print. The paperback is coming out this March, I believe. We have more upcoming virtual events this winter, spring. So please check our live streaming events calendar on the Syosset Library website. Registration is never required for our reader services events. If you enjoyed today's program, you might be interested in joining Jessica and I this Thursday at 7:30 p.m. We're going to be doing a virtual author visit with romance author Alicia Rye, because you know Valentine's Day is this weekend. And the next Afternoons with the Author events will be on exactly a month from today, Tuesday, March 9th at 3 p.m. Sarah Langen will join us to discuss Good Neighbors. And on Tuesday, March 30th at 3 p.m., author Julia Cook will join us to discuss Come Fly the World, the jet age story of the woman of Pan Am. And for the time being, all author visits will be held on Zoom. Woohoo! So stay tuned and keep reading. Have a great afternoon and hope to see you guys next time. Thank you again, Robert. This was awesome. This was a lot of fun to do.
Thank you, Stacy. Thank you, Donna. And thanks, Evelyn, and to Jackie, who emailed me before. Thanks to everybody at the library. And thanks to everyone for coming.